Some of you were here last night. I recognize a few of the faces. It's the second of two presentations on the topic, should we engineer the climate? Last night we had the science. Tonight we're going to have the ethics. This is a Center for Ethics event, but it's riding on the back of an NSF project that has brought 25 experts from Europe, Canada, the United States to Missoula to talk about these issues. Now, the science of climate engineering is fairly complex in itself. The ethics is even more complex, if that's possible. And the Royal Society, an English scientific study group, has suggested that if climate engineering doesn't happen, it probably won't be the science that stops it. It'll probably be the ethics that stops it, or the social, political, ethical, and legal issues. So there's a whole minefield here to do with the ethics of climate engineering, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight. We have a panel of 4 people uniquely suited to talk about these issues, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to be speaking. Andrew Light, some of you might recognize. He's been here before. He actually taught here 12 years ago, something like that. Currently has a position at George Mason University, but also is a senior fellow at CAPS, the Center for American Progress, where he directs their international climate change program.
That was someone from Heritage.
Nancy Tawana, sitting to the left of Andrew, is a philosophy professor at Penn State University. She directs their Rock Ethics Institute and has been working on climate change with that Rock Ethics Institute for a number of years now. Nancy also happens to be my dissertation advisor from years back. Petra Chakert, sitting here, is also at Penn State in the geography department. Petra is a social scientist. She's part of a group at Penn State which is known as the Alliance for Earth Sciences, Engineering and Development in Africa. Her social science work takes place in Tanzania and Ghana. I was going to say Ghana. Tanzania and Ghana. Petra will also be a lead author in a forthcoming IPCC report. She's a lead author in the section on poverty and livelihoods, which is chapter 13. And last night when we had some of the scientific presenters, we had people who had been authors in various sections, and so we have a social scientist who will be an author in the next report. Nicole Hassoun, sitting to Petra's left, is a philosophy professor at Carnegie Mellon University. Last year she was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford. She has a book coming out with Cambridge University Press on global justice issues. So between the 4 of them, we're going to get a lot of prep work on the ethics of solar radiation management and ethical issues related to climate change in general. I've told them to keep to a 12 to 15 minute time limit. And so if you can bear with that, we'll have some discussion after the presentation. So Andrew's first up.
Thanks very much, Christopher, and it's always great to be back in Missoula. I did start my career out here and feels like home every time I come back. I fondly remember teaching Intro to Ethics in this very room. I was telling a friend of mine who's also at the conference, Ben Hale, that one of my best memories was on a beautiful spring day in the middle of a lecture on Kant or something like that, when everyone was falling asleep. A dog walked through the doors carrying a Frisbee in its mouth and was like, "What are you people doing here? It's a really nice day." So clearly, you know, everyone's smart in Missoula, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually I'm not going to talk about geoengineering at all. I'm going to give a little bit of background in the same way that when Alan started the science session yesterday, he gave some background on the science of climate change, of global warming. I'm going to assume some basic familiarity with that and actually talk about what's going on now in terms of international climate policy. So it's a global problem. It requires global solutions. There's no way the problem can be solved by one country alone. Certainly if there are particular individual countries that are holdouts, then that prohibits the possibility of solutions. So you have to have global cooperation. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a primer on where we are currently with respect to international climate negotiations and the particular role of the US in it. And I think showing the gap that exists between where we need to be going in terms of mitigation aspiration, and potentially part of that gap could be could be filled in, at least some of the impacts in terms of temperature increase through geoengineering, which makes geoengineering such an important topic. So many of you know that the real formal discussion about solutions, international climate solutions, started in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio. We're rapidly coming up on the 20-year anniversary of the Earth Summit, and there's a lot of high hopes that by then, hopefully we'll have gotten some more traction than we have along the way. At the Earth Summit in Rio, we started the process of forming the first international climate treaty, the treaty which created the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. In '92, it started the treaty was finalized in 1992, then you finally got ratification in 1994. This is a treaty that the United States signed on to. In fact, it was unanimously ratified by the US Senate. So those who say the United States has never signed on to a climate treaty, it's not true. It does not bind any parties, though, to particular emissions cuts. So it was only the framework around which you would come up with later agreements to bind people to emission cuts. There's now 192 countries that are part of the UNFCCC. And interestingly, I think its most sort of unique the most unique thing about it is it operates under a consensus process. It was actually something that the United States insisted on in the formation of the UNFCCC. Every single country has effectively a veto on moving forward with any agreements, political or legal, that come out of this process. This makes it an incredibly difficult process to work. My colleagues across the hall from me at the Center for American Progress, who work on domestic legislation and domestic climate issues, are always bemoaning this terrible hurdle they have of coming up with 60 votes out of 100 in the US Senate. And I always go, look, I'd love to only go for that proportion, right? I've got to get 100% of votes in the UNFCCC, or at least no one standing up and objecting in order to get something through. So it's a very difficult process, but nonetheless, in 1998, they finished work on the first international climate treaty that does require emissions reductions from some signatory parties. That's, of course, the Kyoto Protocol. It finally went into force in 2004 when Russia signed it. There was a sort of a minimum number of countries that had to sign the Kyoto Protocol, representing a minimum amount of global emissions to put it into effect. The Kyoto Protocol really, I think, manages to do a couple things, interestingly. It doesn't solve the problem of climate change. It doesn't mandate sufficient emission reductions to really get us to where we need to go. But two things that it did, I think, pretty effectively. The first was it took language from the UNFCCC of common but differentiated responsibilities, and it tried to make sense of some of the more difficult ethical problems that are sort of intrinsic to the climate problem. And that is that the carbon that's in the atmosphere now, that's causing the warming that we've already experienced and that will continue to be the primary anthropogenic forcing on the warming that we'll see through the next couple decades, is by and large the carbon that was put up there by the developed countries. Us, the European Union, Australia, Japan, these countries. This was the carbon that was the engine that stimulated our economic growth, that allowed us to pull ourselves to the position that we are, and is primarily one of the biggest differences between the development that we've had and the development that has not occurred yet in other parts of the world. And so given that the carbon that's up there now is the carbon that's causing the problem, and given that we have states of inequality, for example, in India, where I now do a lot of my work, there are 400 million people in energy poverty who don't have access to reliable sources of electricity. And there's lots of impacts that are caused by that abject poverty, that in the first pass at making emission reduction cuts, the so-called, what they decided to call, in a kind of a not very imaginative distinction, the Annex 1 and the non-Annex 1 countries. The Annex 1, or the developed countries, would make the first pass at cuts, only expecting later, hopefully, that the non-Annex 1 countries would go ahead and make some cuts in emissions. And so that's the first thing they did, is they sort of said, all right, for what's called the first commitment period, which ends in 2012, the first pass at emissions cuts will be made by the developed countries, the ones that are responsible for this. And this is thought to be an embodiment of this idea that we all have common responsibilities because it is a global problem, but these are differentiated by history. So the first target was 5.2% on average below 1990 levels by 2012. And we'll see how close the different parties that signed on to that and continued to adhere to that goal, how close they will get. The non-Annex 1 countries were not required to make any emissions cuts. Now, by and large, that's uncontroversial. The problem, of course, is that you can't really put all non-Annex I countries or all developing countries in the same basket in terms of their carbon profile. So there's a big difference between the top 6 emitters in the developing world, China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, and South Africa, and everyone else. So there's a huge difference between the amount of carbon that the world's largest emitter now, is China, is emitting, and say a country like Ghana, and the amount of emissions that we can expect into the future. And so by the sort of just the brute physics of the matter, I think will require reductions from at least that cluster of large developing emitters as well as the developed countries to get there. Now, the response by the United States immediately, in fact, even before the ink on the Kyoto Protocol was dry, was to say that the United States would not even consider signing on to the Kyoto Protocol. So in July of 1997, before the Kyoto Protocol was actually finished, during the Clinton administration, the Senate voted 95-0. This is amazing in and of itself because, of course, the United States Senate today couldn't agree on, well, anything, right? So National Cheese Week they wouldn't be able to agree on. But they agreed on this, that they would not even consider looking at the Kyoto Protocol if it was presented to them by the Clinton administration. And the reason that they stipulate, though, I mean, some might I think some in fact, I've heard John Kerry in retrospect say, oh, well, it was really about the science of the matter and we really couldn't, solve the problem without the developing emitters. If you look at the actual text of the Byrd-Hagel resolution from 1997, essentially it's about worries about economic competitiveness, right? That if there are going to have to be economic hits that are incurred for beginning to make reductions in emissions, then the United States Senate was not going to stand for an agreement which gave a free pass to what were becoming clearly our biggest economic competitors in a number of different sectors. And that essentially was it. In fact, they named China and India in the Byrd-Hagel resolution, and that has continued to be a theme that comes out every time we try to pass climate legislation in the United States. Now, what that effectively meant is that a lot of the sort of the traction that you wanted to get out of the Kyoto Protocol was really stalled out, effectively because at the time the world's largest emitter, certainly still now the world's largest per capita emitter, the United States did not have to make reductions. Fast forward to 2007. In 2007, so the UN FCCC has these yearly climate summits, the most famous of which is the last one that we just had last year in Copenhagen. In 2007, they were meeting in Bali, and they there sort of essentially came up with an interesting formula, and it was embodied in a document called the Bali Roadmap, variously the Bali Roadmap or the Bali Action Plan, which came up with the kind of the bare bones of a deal for how you could get developing countries to begin to make reductions, perhaps mandatory, that was sort of left unstipulated. That would then be joined to the reductions that you would hopefully see in something like a new climate treaty or a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. And so in Copenhagen, essentially the deal, there's a lot of details to it, but essentially the deal was that developing countries, especially the major emitters, would begin to make emission reduction cuts in exchange for two things: financing and access to clean energy technology. And that was the deal. And surprisingly, in the 11th hour, the 11th minute, in a very dramatic reversal, the Bush administration actually agreed to this language at the very, very end of the day. And they also decided that they set Copenhagen as the deadline. The 2009 meeting in Copenhagen was going to be where we were actually going to get a new binding climate treaty, which, unlike the Kyoto Protocol, would set much more ambitious goals and get us on the path to some kind of climate stabilization. So then we fast forward to December 2009, and the Copenhagen meeting. There's tons to say about the Copenhagen meeting. The vast majority of people who have various sort of levels of interest in climate think the Copenhagen meeting was a complete failure. My perspective, and there's a minority view out there, that it wasn't a complete failure, that in fact it was going to be a total failure. And at the very last minute, in the last month leading up to the Copenhagen meeting, the Danes, the chairs of the meeting, came up with a kind of an interesting, innovative proposal that made it possible to get some kind of political agreement out of it. And if you want to talk about that later, we can talk about it like after this session is over. But here's what they did. They signed there was a political agreement that emerged out of the Copenhagen meeting. It has a number of interesting parts of it, though totally incomplete and not legally binding and not nearly what we wanted to see when we started working in 2007 on, on the ramp up to a final agreement, it did at least set a few sort of things that were some progress. So first of all, there was a political agreement that even though they didn't decide what exactly the reductions in emissions were going to be for developed and developing countries, they did all sign a political agreement that said that the goal has to be to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels, which was a modicum of progress. That had been articulated by the G8 nations before, in just 7 months earlier at their July meeting in Italy, but had not been articulated by a lot of the developing countries before as something they were willing to put their signature on. They also made a kind of an incremental advance on the promise that was made in Bali that in exchange for financing, developing countries would begin to reduce their emissions, and it came in 2 parts. The agreement that from 2010 to 2012, developed countries would transmit some $30 billion in what's called fast start financing for developing countries, and that the goal by 2020 would be to come up with a global climate fund that would provide $100 billion annually from developed to developing countries. And again, meeting with this basic idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. It would be unfair to require developing countries to pay for their transition onto a low carbon pathway given their development needs. And there were also some extremely interesting agreements on language in a number of areas, including what's very important for the United States on measurement, reporting, and verification. Now, again, it's a political agreement. It's not binding. It was thought to be a good first step in what was promised to be a 2-step process to eventually turn this into a legally binding agreement. It still possibly could. It won't happen this year, though, for certain. But one of the things that did happen because of this is that you've got, first of all, the $30 billion, which is going to come through. All that money is in the pipeline. The US will contribute between $4 billion to $5.2 billion to that. The Japanese are essentially going to make sure that we actually hit the $30 billion mark. And the interesting thing there, which I think gives us the sort of the framework for where I think we are as we start debating geoengineering solutions, is that there was a requirement that all the countries who wanted to align themselves to the Copenhagen Accord, this is December 2009, had to, by the end of January 2010, had to submit what their low carbon development plan was consistent with the 2-degree target. So whereas before you had a mishmash of different national action plans that had been submitted by different places, by the end of January you had 120 countries saying the principles in the Copenhagen Accord were a good idea, and you had over 40 who actually said, here are the steps that we're going to take sector by sector, and here are the emission reductions that we want to get. Now, I'm going to show you some data from Project Catalyst, which is a group that was sort of evolved. It's supported by McKinsey and Company. It has a number of contentious assumptions in it, but I think it does demonstrate that there are ways in which you can add up what has been done collectively, what you can read from those promises for emission reductions by 2020 that were required in the Copenhagen Accord, and you can get some sense of where we are collectively in terms of essentially individual nations, what they are promising to do in advance of hopefully eventually signing a binding international treaty. This particular set of analysis has been confirmed by a couple other independent modelers. The assumption for the slide, which is going to show you the reductions, is the following one. Is that where we're headed in terms of the business as usual path in terms of emissions is getting to 70 gigatons of carbon and carbon equivalent, so carbon and the other greenhouse gases, by 2030. That on this assumption, where you need to get on a plausible pathway on this analysis for stabilizing at 2 degrees Celsius, not a guarantee, but a sort of a reasonable chance, is stabilizing the atmospheric concentration of carbon in the atmosphere at 450 parts per million, that you're going to at least have to get down to 35, and that's with an overshoot, by 2030. And so if you back that up to 2020, which is the year that where people sort of filled in and said, here's where this is the year by which we're willing to commit to our reductions, 10 years from now, you need to go from where we will be there, 61, down to 44 gigatons annually. If you add up all of those 40 plus submissions, every single one of them, which is a lot of detail, then you get something like this, We start here with that 61 where we're going without countries doing anything other than what they're doing right now. And we can take a few gigatons off in terms of getting to that 44 right off the top. The first one is the impact of the economic downturn. Takes about a gigaton and a half out of the system annually. This is not a recommended way of achieving climate stabilization. It's actually going to turn out in updated analysis that this is actually a little bit larger because the recovery has been slower, but that's sort of part of their assumption. Better news, though, is that a lot of the forestry plans that have been put in place since the 90s are having a bigger impact than people thought they were having. And so in the model, you can take a gigaton and a half out there. Kind of a good indication of this is the United Nations just released a report demonstrating that in this decade, 2000 to 2010, the total amount of hectares of lost forest cover is equal to what we were losing per year in the 90s. So there's a significant amount of progress there. Doesn't solve the problem again, but it does give us a little bit of a leg up. And then in this analysis, what is done is there's a division made between high end or sort of the low ambition cases and high ambition cases. And what this meant is that in many of the submissions to the Copenhagen Accord, they were submitted as conditional. So Europe, for example, said, we're willing to cut our emissions 20% below 1990 levels by 2020, but if the US and other developed countries come somewhere to approximate our ambition in cuts, we will increase our ambition to 30%. The US also made a conditional pledge. They said they were going to cut 17% below 2005 levels by 2020, but they said it was contingent on legislation. And so if there's no legislation, then we don't count the 17% in here. If there is legislation, then we counted the 17% in here. And what you get is this, is that basically if everyone was to do what they say they're going to do, according to those submissions that were made at the end of January, then we have about a 4.8 gigaton gap. Now, again, it's controversial. I think the gap to actually get a reasonable shot at holding it at 2 degrees Celsius is obviously higher than this. But I think it sort of shows you that the sort of the mantra of some of my colleagues in the philosophy world, that, you know, nothing is kind of happening and that no one is doing anything is in fact kind of wrong. That in fact there are national action plans. The national action plans are also, interestingly enough, the only other comment I make, and I want to wrap this up in just a second, is that by and large these national action plans are not altruistic. This is entirely the bulk of it, I would sort of say, other than the European submission where they promised to go up to 30% because they're good guys, is largely out of self-interest. What you get out of here are a lot of national action plans which are organized around saving money because of efficiency, or energy security, by moving to renewable energy, by not being reliant on foreign oil. If you really kind of look at the motivation for this, when I look at sort of what China is doing, they spent a much larger percentage of their stimulus package, for example, on renewable energy and other kinds of efficiency targets than the United States did. South Korea did as well. If you look at sort of individual national action plans, I think these are not, you would sort of say, these are just motivated out of, they weren't bound, these were not where their feet were not held to the fire by a legally binding agreement saying some bad consequences would happen if you didn't cut your emissions. This is essentially, I think, something like a picture of what you get out of just what people think is in their immediate self-interest. Now, obviously, this doesn't hold temperature at 2 degrees Celsius. It doesn't get us where we need to go, but it does show us that I think that you can sort of get some of these, there's a gap there that you can measure, given a few assumptions, that you could move in and sort of try to do something about. Now, the last thing I want to sort of say about this is, like, where are we now in the United States? And I won't go through all this. Where we are now is we're all kind of depressed and disappointed. While we passed I think a pretty good climate bill in the US House of Representatives in July 2009, in July 2020, or just this past summer, the Senate abandoned its attempts to pass a climate bill. And I was prepared to really be worried about what was going to happen internationally, because what could have immediately, I think, totally stopped in its tracks any kind of international discussion about anything, adaptation, mitigation, geoengineering, would be if the United States said, look, just threw up their hands and said, look, there's no way we can do anything. The good news, though, is that in one of the interim negotiating sessions for the international process, immediately after the Senate bill collapsed, My former colleague, Todd Stern, who's the chief climate envoy for the United States, sent his chief deputy to this meeting in Bonn, Germany, and they immediately removed the condition they had put on their submission to the Copenhagen Accord. They said, we are still committed to 17% cuts below 2005 as our contribution, even if there's no legislation. And they'll try to do it with direct regulation through the authority the president has under the Clean Air Act, and a state action, and hopefully some smaller pieces of legislation that may or may not pass after the election. So that's where we are. The U.S. sort of effectively said, oh, look, now obviously they need to prove how they're going to do this, but at least they bound themselves to the pledge. They also bound themselves to the pledge of contributing to fast start financing. But I think as we approach this meeting in Cancun, I think the question still remains, given that the U.S. is in such a kind of a fluctuating position now, even on a very optimistic scenario, how are we going to get this last 1/3 of emissions out of the system, given where we are now? And I think that certainly leaves a lot of important work to be done, which can be filled in by a number of different mechanisms.
Good evening. Following this talk, which is a good framing because one of the questions is where are our needs, is to think about think with you a little bit about what we've been talking about, which is the ethics of solar radiation management. Just in case you weren't here last night, I put in a slide that gives you a sense of various different proposals that have been talked about to what is called geoengineer under the larger term. We've been talking a lot about solar radiation management, reflecting some of the sunlight back, and we've been talking a lot about this one. This is another proposal, but we haven't really been talking about it because it's, in terms of engineering, not really feasible. A little bit about cloud seeding, but that's what we've been talking about. What I want to spend some time talking about is the ethics of thinking about this. But I want to frame it in terms of the current state of discourse, because sometimes there are miscommunications or misconceptions that we've got people suggesting that what we do is just engage in solar radiation management. And that's a misconception. What is being proposed is a complex 3-part process of deep cuts in global emissions, or what we call mitigation, what Andrew was talking about in terms of supporting the type of work that the Frameworks Convention has been working on, supporting adaptation because there are going to be some unavoidable harms, so we are going to have to adapt to a climate change world, and then including solar radiation management, testing, monitoring, and possibly even deployment for specific reasons. To consider even testing at some level solar radiation management, but especially in considering deploying it, you raise a number of ethical considerations that I've listed here, and which I'll be talking a bit about tonight, and my colleagues will continue developing in more depth once I've finished. There are a variety of different ethical issues, and I want to just highlight some of them. If you were here last night, Alan listed 20 reasons we should be concerned about geoengineering. We probably could list about 100 ethical issues that we'd have to deal with in order to engage in responsible solar radiation management. I can't do all 100, so I'm just going to try to hint at a few and encourage you to be thinking as individuals and citizens about which are important to you. I want to start off with some political risks that have been identified. And one of the worries is a worry that some people call a moral hazard, which is, what if one of the unintended side effects of this research and testing is a slowing down of the efforts towards mitigation? So as you could hear as Andrew was talking, the Frameworks Convention is definitely starting to have an impact. It is moving towards a reasonable target for mitigation. It's not perfect, but it is making progress. But one concern is, what if this solution Okay, quote unquote. What if it got perceived as an easier solution, one that would avoid all the complexities of mitigation? Okay, not that the people who support testing solar radiation mitigation are advocating that, but it's a concern that it might have that impact. And that would be an ethical problem. So one question would be, how do we test for this phenomena? You heard about a lot of things we needed to test for scientifically and even technologically last night. But there are also phenomena we have to test for to figure out the ethics of the situation. Another concern, might the research itself make the use of solar radiation management more likely? And in particular, might it lead to unregulated, unilateral, or self-interested use? So, for example, one concern that's being talked about, at least by some ethicists, is the fact that there are some states who have so much at stake that they might just decide unilaterally, we don't have anything else to lose. So take a small island developing state who, if the sea level rise keeps rising, will literally lose their land. They'll lose the ability to live in that region. They will no longer be a nation. They will no longer have a state. They might decide, we have nothing to lose. It doesn't matter how bad things get. We're just going to go ahead and unilaterally try to manage the melt. Okay. That might cause problems because deployment, maybe even partial deployment for research purposes, could result in geopolitical catastrophes where one nation says, wait a minute, you don't have the right to modify my climate. Okay? It could also be used, and some worry about it being used for immoral purposes. I've already talked about some of them, but someone could be, not even trying to act in self-interest, but using it to harm others. And there's some worries about whether or not it could be used in that way. What this suggests, all of these political risks suggest, is that, and I won't talk a lot about this, but it does mean we need a very clear and ethical governance structure. So another question is, how do we get that governance structure? So again, these are all ethical issues. All of them need to be not only considered, but we need to develop empirical evidence and start to think about how we will manage these risks. Another risk that I listed were inequalities in impacts, which Petra will be talking about in more depth, but I will just mention that distributive justice is one arena of justice which is one that philosophers and ethicists worry a lot about, and that's concerning the fairness of the distributions of harms and benefits from actions, and in particular whether the relationships between the harms a group is subjected to or the benefits a group receives and their contributions to the problem of climate change. One of the things that's already been recognized in the climate change discourse is that those who've contributed the most to the problem of climate change are those who, in general, will not be impacted as severely and who are not as vulnerable as groups who have contributed less. So what's the problem? And you heard about this last night to some extent, but just in case you weren't here, I'll quote from at least one of the scientists who talked last night, David Keith. A world cooled by managing sunlight will not be the same one cooled by lowering emissions. And these are a few of the changes that are predicted using our best science. There'll be changes in precipitation as well as distribution of rainfall. There'll be winners and losers. Some areas are more protected with this type of intervention than others. Could weaken monsoon rains and winds, will not combat ocean acidification, cause other risks like delaying the recovery of the ozone hole. And then there are questions about whether or not, once it's in place, is it sustainable? So what are the risks and costs of failure and difficulties concerning the intended withdrawing of solar radiation management. As you heard last night in the presentations, it's not just the temperature change, but the rate of change that often is problematic for various different concerns. I won't talk too much about environmental risks, as that'll be the subject of our actually a fourth presentation. But we do have to worry about the ways in which ecosystems and non-humans will be impacted by solar radiation management. These are also groups that will be impacted by climate change, but nonetheless, as we walk through the ethical concerns, we have to think about differential impacts. I want to make sure that we also consider, in the little bit of time I have to offer you some of the ethical concerns, the fact of human rights. And there are generally agreed upon human rights which are inalienable and which we do not have the right to violate unless our own rights are being violated. One of the problems with intentional manipulation of the weather is that we can put the rights, basic rights, of certain groups of people in jeopardy. And that starts to raise profound ethical issues that aren't going to be easy to address. We have basic principles in bioethics and medicine called do no harm. That's also a basic principle in engineering. You know, hold paramount the health of the environment and of others around you. So one of the things we've learned from bioethics is that if you are subjecting groups of people to potential harms, you must have informed consent. So that begins to raise the question of what would informed consent look like in this type of context where there's going to be potential global impacts. It's also the case that regional diversity in responses could make consensus about the optimal level of geoengineering difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. One of my worries is I've participated in the Frameworks Convention now for 6 years, and I've seen how difficult it is to come to consensus. I'm not sure we'd get a global consensus easily on solar radiation management, in particular around what should our goals be, because our goals are normative. We're making decisions about what we value. It might be about maintaining a balance of the Greenland ice sheet to protect sea level rise, which impacts some groups but not others. It could be to return to pre-industrial temperatures. It could be to not just return to pre-industrial temperatures, but to be aware of not reducing global precipitation below pre-industrial levels, which isn't the same. Or it could be avoid exposing significant numbers of people to novel climate conditions or variations. Perhaps it's a Rawlsian, do the least harm to the most vulnerable, that what we might do is identify the most vulnerable groups and make sure they are the most protected by the research. But what we make as our goal is a normative decision. It's a value decision. It's a decision that we would have to make in a governance structure that would be participatory and democratic. I sometimes worry about a false dilemma of looking for scientific or technological solutions to maybe what is not a scientific or technological problem, but rather a problem in human behavior and human motivation. As you heard from Andrew, we are working towards a treaty that'll bring us as a global community to a safer level of emissions. And perhaps what we might want to do are studies on how to encourage individuals, societies, nations, and global communities to work together to find a solution more quickly. We do have limited research funds. There's only so many things we can study. How do we make a decision where to put our money? How do we make a decision where to put our energies? Because that's a normative decision too. It's a decision about what's most important and what we most need. So I want to just remind you that in a lot of what I've talked about, I've put the issue of governance on the table. And governance in terms of an ethical and morally acceptable form of decision process about solar radiation management is also something that we all have to worry about. So I will let you just read this while I hand my mic over to Petra, and she'll talk more about some of the issues that I raised.
Yes. Which one is yes? Thanks. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. It's my first time in Montana. I would want to address, and I hope you will think with me, about some of the global challenges we face. And in essence, this is what wraps up what I'm going to say. We're talking about a very unequal world, and the question is whether or not geoengineering or solar radiation management in particular is going to exacerbate that unequal world we see, or whether or not it's going to reduce that gap we face today. So the problem is that, as you see, some of us, few of us, it's few of us here, that's us, we've already emitted that much, right? That's us here, that's the rich world. And then there are plenty of these other ones, that's the poor world, and they have emitted relatively less. And the question is, how can we balance these two? Andrew already mentioned where our emissions come from. You may not have seen a world map like this, but you essentially see here is the size of countries proportional to their emissions, right? And we have no problem recognizing where the United States is. You may see where Japan is. My work is primarily in West Africa, and it barely shows up on the map, right? So what we have here clearly is a historic responsibility of emissions that have occurred primarily in what Andrew called these Annex I countries. I want you to note, however, as well that what is counted here is only emission production. We're not counting emission consumption. So anything that is produced in China or in India and that we consume is counted in China, right? Even though we produce it. So it's another element of inequality built in here. We call this ecological debt because essentially what we have done is to ask the atmosphere to absorb all our emissions, and essentially there isn't a whole lot of space left in the atmosphere to absorb emissions from developing or non-Annex I countries. So that's that inequality we face here. And I think we should really think how solar radiation management fits in here. The problem is, and I think Nancy mentioned that very briefly, it's not only that we have emitted more, it's also that these countries that haven't emitted a whole lot are most vulnerable to the impacts or negative impacts of climate change. And that's what we call differential vulnerability. So all of a sudden you see African countries that were barely visible on the previous map. Now they show up because they're in dark orange or in red. They have the highest vulnerability. Why? Well, because many of these countries and the populations that live there are dependent on climate-related resources, right? That's rain-fed agriculture. So they will feel the impacts earliest. We also have to admit that many of these countries have low adaptive capacity. They don't have a lot of wiggle room to adjust and to adapt, right? Many of us here, I don't know if you guys are farmers or if you do any farming, you have probably crop insurance. Many of the people I work with don't, right? So that's what we call adaptive capacity. Now, we always talk about the polar bear, that's kind of our icon of climate change, but the people I work with, as I said, they feel the consequences, and they already feel them now. That's increased frequency and severity of extreme events, both droughts and floods, but also obviously sea level rise, and then impacts on the food they eat, the food they produce, the food they eat. So that's that inequality we face, and what do we do about it? What we have to do is probably address the issue of consumption that you haven't heard mentioned yesterday. One of the reasons we in the North, the Annex I countries, have such high emissions is because of our consumption levels. If you guys have never seen The Story of Stuff, I would say check it out. Just a simple example. If you want to have a cup of tea, think about everything, all the input that goes into producing that cup of tea. You know, all the electricity, the transportation, the fossil fuel, the water treatment, everything that goes into just producing your little tea bag. And think about all the output. I know you probably won't have tea tomorrow morning, but that's the purpose, right? Think about what is our consumption level and if that is really necessary. So that's that unbalanced world, that inequality. And again, the question is, does solar radiation management fit in there at all? Andrew mentioned various details related to the UN Convention and the process. I want to point out two more details, which I think are incredibly important to understand what we're dealing with here. In the UN Convention, and as you may all know, the US signed on to the UN Convention, or Framework Convention on Climate Change, there's an article called 4.4 that requires industrialized countries to assist particularly vulnerable developing countries in meeting the costs of adaptation. That's in the convention. Yeah, we're obligated to assist these countries in adaptation. Question is, does solar radiation management address adaptation? In the Bali roadmap that Andrew mentioned, there's something else which is incredibly important. Countries, or parties as they're called in the convention, agreed on a shared vision for long-term cooperative action. Shared vision, including a long-term global goal for emission reductions to achieve the ultimate objective of the convention, which is to avoid dangerous climate change. A shared vision. Again, how is solar radiation management fitting into that? Is it a shared vision? Has, in fact, everybody signed on to it? Is that what the world wants? And are we following our commitments after Copenhagen? You have heard it may have been a disaster. The question is, should we just give up that process of negotiations because we feel we have a technical solution? Or are we committed to a process even though we understand the process is difficult? That was one too fast. Shared vision. Is it or is it not? I want to mention two challenges, two ethical challenges that come up very often in the social science debate. One is called spatial heterogeneity, a beautiful term, embellishing the fact that, well, some regions, some people are going to get screwed. Right? Now, which are these regions? Is it going to be us? Well, most likely not. It's going to be, again, these countries that already experience the negative impacts of climate change, and these are the tropical and the subtropical regions. Unknown, yet not necessarily unintentional consequences are likely to affect tropical and subtropical regions disproportionately. And you may remember Alan's first point yesterday that Africa and Asia, right, most likely will experience changes in the monsoon patterns, which will have impact on their water availability and food production. The second one Nancy mentioned briefly is lack of governance. We don't have a governance model. We don't have a body that really allows us to understand who is allowed to do what and when and where and for how long. There's something that is called a voluntary code of practice, but guess who is part of that voluntary code of practice? Well, it's not Ghana, right? It's the countries, the parties, the scientists, and the industries that are behind solar radiation management, and so they probably will design their own code of action or of practice. Unilateral action, well, those countries who have the technical capabilities today will and already have acted. And that's a problem for those countries who don't have these capabilities and most likely are in the tropics and most likely will get harmed. And then we have the risk of gold fingers. No, not gold fingers, that's a mistake. It should be green fingers. Why are they called green fingers? Well, these are individuals who have the resources, who have plenty of money. Can you think of an example?
Banks.
What?
Banking institutions.
Banking, but an individual.
Richard Branson.
Richard Branson, Bill Gates, right? These are green fingers who may engage in unilateral action without any country agreeing to it. They may do it because they're self-proclaimed saviors of our planet. I want to point that out. I shared that yesterday with my colleagues. If you Google hand-holding globe, and you can do that, try it. You get about 32 pages of different images, pictures in Google, hand-holding globe. There's not a single black hand holding a globe. What does that mean? Does that mean we don't trust our African colleagues to be good stewards of our planet? And if that's what it is, then I think we have to reconsider what we do here. Responsibility and justice. For sure, we can tackle climate change as a technological challenge. But we also can understand climate change as a question of fairness and justice that may require a completely different model of development and also may require from us a responsibility to protect the vulnerable. Think about that for a second. What does that mean for solar radiation management? The responsibility to protect the vulnerable. If that's what we should do, well, how are we going to tackle it with, let's say, sulfate aerosol dispersal? Nancy mentioned our responsibility, our willingness to avoid harm. What guarantees can we give today that the strategies we have in mind as scientists will not harm people? Actually, we can take it further. Will anybody benefit? Especially those people who are at risk, who already experience negative impacts. There's something in ethics which is understood as a deontological ethical position. It's our duty to do the right thing, to protect vulnerable people, independent of the consequences. They may be good, but maybe we're engaging in something that is way too risky and we shouldn't even try it. One of the key concepts in here in the justice debate is human security. It's not national security. It's the security of an individual to fulfill his or her rights. Again, the solar radiation management facilitate or hinder human security. It's not only about technology, it's also about shared visions, shared experiences. It's about sympathy with other people. It's about solidarity. And it's also about interconnectedness between us, between the ecosystems, and about the fragility of our planet. Again, how do you think solar radiation management fits in here? Last one to wrap up. What are our global ethical obligations? Number one, there's no way around it. We have to reduce our carbon footprint. We have to change our lifestyle. There's no question. I think we have to care for remote others. We have to engage with them. We have to show our sympathy, our solidarity. I think we have to move from big science, science we do, science we are proud of, to something we may call diverse science that engages people from other countries, maybe governments, but maybe also indigenous people, maybe farmers whose crops may be at risk. Maybe we need something like eco-scientists without borders. Maybe we need an independent, interdisciplinary, intercultural board that assesses what strategies are used and which not. We want to understand really in detail what disproportional harm means. Under what strategies, at what spatial scale, at what temporal scale, what impact the strategy may have on crops, on water systems, on diseases. And I think until we don't really know, I don't think we may want to endorse a practice. We have to understand that these both testing and deployment of SRM are an intentional perturbation of the system. We do that intentionally. And maybe what we want to guarantee at the same time is some kind of procedural justice. Nancy talked about distributive justice. Procedural justice implies participation and recognition of other people's needs. Maybe we have to think about compensation. If harm cannot be excluded, how do we calculate compensation? And if we spend money on compensation, well then for sure, the strategies you may have heard about yesterday will become more expensive. And then they're not that appealing anymore. And the last one I want to mention, and then I turn it over. If we want to engage in geoengineering, at that tricky point in the international discussions, are we sending the right signal that allows us to pursue the shared vision we have agreed upon or not? Is it the right signal we want to send? Is it the right signal now? Thanks.
All right, can you hear me? Yeah, awesome. Okay, so thanks for having me. I'm excited to be in Montana. It's such a beautiful, wild place. You've got these mountains, and it's amazing. And so I'm going to talk today a little bit about something I think has been left out of the discussion of geoengineering, which is the natural value that we might disrupt if we geoengineer the planet. So the idea is that geoengineering, like climate change, may radically transform the planet without taking into consideration appropriately some natural values. So if you install a thermostat on the Earth and you put it under human control, are we losing something of importance? Of course, there's a lot of other arguments, and you've heard some of them, that have to do with potential effects of geoengineering on humans, right? Sulfur is bad for you. They want to throw it up in the atmosphere. It's going to come down eventually, right? So you might think about what are the consequences of these different policies for human beings. But I'm going to, again, focus on something that I think's been left out of this discussion, which is that, I guess, being in this place, maybe you'll agree with me, but I think that natural things and processes have significant value, so I'm going to argue for that. And then I'm going to say we shouldn't risk damaging things of significant value unless we have good reason to do so, that some kinds of geoengineering processes damage natural things and processes, and so we shouldn't do some kinds of geoengineering unless we have good reasons. So I'm going to give you this argument. I'll qualify it a little at the end, but it's a new argument against geoengineering. Okay. So you might think initially this is a total non-starter. Look, humans are natural. What we do is natural. If we interfere with natural processes, that's natural. So what could you possibly have to complain about? But I think that there's two senses of natural. In one sense, we're natural, but in another sense, there's things that are very artificial and things that are very wild, right? So on one hand, you have the cars and the trains and the planes, and on the other side, you have the unmanaged forests, the wildest places on Earth, and then there's a whole continuum, right? Things that are more or less influenced by human control. And so I'm going to talk about those things that are on this side of the spectrum and suggest that they really have some important value that we might want to attend to. I'm going to start really small, and then I'll bring it back to the case of geoengineering. So last year I was living in Palo Alto, California. It's also a really beautiful place. There's big mountain hill-like things going on. And, and in my backyard there was this tree. It was cool. It had like these big pears. I ate them. They were great. And it provided a great home for squirrels. It was all twisted and snarled and ugly. And it provided shade, and I heard the birds singing, and I loved it. All right, I love this tree. It was great. But the city of Palo Alto had a tree problem. It really hated trees, and it wanted to cut them all down. And its only justification for this, in this case, was that they wanted to plant some indigenous trees. Right? It wasn't like the tree was falling down, it was going to hurt anyone. Now I thought about this, and this seemed really wrong to me. I was like, no, you can't cut down the tree. Right? And I had a big discussion with the city. I kept calling them up on the phone, and they even got my environmental ethics students involved in this. And it seemed to me what was really wrong with it wasn't what was happening to the squirrels. I worried a bit about the squirrels, right? Or even what was happening with me, right? Like I liked the fruit and that was great. But even if it didn't do anything for people or animals, the idea that we could just simply disregard that tree, right, was baffling to me, that there wasn't some natural value in the tree. Okay. It was kind of like, paving over paradise and putting in a parking lot. Right? Now, it's not that I think you can't do this kind of thing. Occasionally, right, it's appropriate to put in parking lots, of course. And sometimes if you think about the natural process and you put in a parking lot like this, that might even be good for it, right? A bike parking lot I'd have no problem with. What I'm objecting to, is we'll go back to this, is the imposition of a risk, even, of significant damage or destructions of things of natural value when we don't have good reason, right? For fun, for instance. It's cool. Science, one of these guys out here said to me, one of the scientists said, oh, it's really cool that they're doing this new scientific thing. What was it? I don't remember. Cloud something. And I was like, yeah, okay, that's cool. Maybe I missed the coolness of science, but I don't know. The idea is that there's a way of treating nature that could be wrong. It doesn't attend to natural value. So it's the kind of thing that we do if we just stomp on a bug for no reason, right? We could take it outside. Or we throw things at squirrels. Little kids tend to do this. They don't know any better. You can't blame them. But if you saw adults, throwing things at squirrels just for fun, you'd say that's probably a wrong thing to do. Of course, sometimes it's other things of value are at stake, right? So if you want to preserve some trees, you might not have as many jobs for loggers, right? And I didn't blame the guy that wanted to cut down my tree. He took the time to tell the city he didn't want to cut it down either, but he needed the job. Right? On the other hand, the city didn't have that excuse, okay? The city didn't need the job. Well, maybe they did, I don't know. Now, the one thing the city did say is they're concerned about indigenous species, and you might think, well, that's really great, right? But I had a really hard time with this because I thought, well, what is the ecosystem in my backyard? And in the absence of the tree, I was having a real hard time telling what it was. Now, this might seem a bit ridiculous, but there's a real question here. What do you want to restore it to? Is it to the kind of tree that was there before they moved into the neighborhood? Before they planted that particular tree? Before we had that neighborhood at all, their city? One of the interesting papers I read in Science is that a proposal for rewilding North America. So some people suggest we should introduce elephants as proxy for the mammoth. And I think they're really serious that we need wild ungulates in North America. But I guess it seems like there's this question. I'm not really sure the idea of that makes sense. Okay, now I might be wrong about the city case, and maybe it does make sense, but I hope that you understand what it is that I'm objecting to. Right? Destruction of things of natural value, unless there's a good reason. Now, this doesn't tell us anything about geoengineering yet. I'll get to that. But what I hope you can see is if one tree is valuable, has significant natural value, then a place with lots of trees and maybe really cool grass and maybe cool fish, right, an ecosystem, could also have some kind of significant value. And so I actually think that the kind of value isn't reducible to its value for human interests, right? Sometimes we shouldn't put in a parking lot even when it makes it more convenient for humans, even when it's better for humans. So to help you get at that idea, consider this. Suppose you're the last person on Earth and the last sentient creature in all of the universe. If you really wanted to destroy the last river or wetland ecosystem just before your death, would it be acceptable for you to do so? Or if it's another dude, would it be acceptable for that person to do so? I guess my intuition is no, right? That would be needless destruction. You'd be destroying something beautiful. Why? Why would you do that? And you'd be doing something wrong. Now, you don't have to agree with me about that. That's pretty radical, okay? You can just think that these natural ecosystems, they do a lot of good things for people, right? They clean our water and so forth. And insofar as they're valuable for people and we want to preserve things, they have a certain kind of natural value. Okay, but I'm going to go ahead with the geoengineering. So with this idea in mind, what can it tell us about geoengineering? Well, one thing we know is geoengineering is done by people, right? And there's a lot of different kinds of it. Some of them even are planting trees. So we can't object to all kinds of geoengineering this way. But with respect to solar radiation management and other kinds of geoengineering, where the goal is to change the Earth atmosphere system such that we cool the planet, right? I think there might be room for objection. Okay, and why is this? Well, if we cool the planet, right, one of the things that's going to happen is that this fish isn't going to do so well. It's a walleye pollock. It prefers hotter temperatures. And this fish provides the food for a lot of us, right? It's a big feedstock for us and for a lot of other species. And so if you cool the planet, you're going to greatly change not only the northern aquatic ecosystem, but other ecosystems. Similarly, whether the planet is hotter or colder changes the way that plants photosynthesize. Of course, plants provide the food for almost everything else on the planet, right? And that can change the way a lot of ecosystems function. So I guess I'm worried about some of the risks of harm to both human and non-human creatures as a result of changing these natural processes. Besides, I think the climate system itself is really cool. right? I'd be sad to see that kind of thing go away. That said, here's the qualification. If geoengineering really is necessary to protect our interests, clearly we ought to do it, right? If we're not going to survive without geoengineering. If there's something of significant value at stake and we can hear the argument that it really is necessary to preserve those other things we really care about, fine. That's right, we should do it. But I haven't heard that argument. I've been sitting here for a week and I haven't heard it. Okay. Now, you might also argue that, well, a geoengineered planet would be pretty cool. Some things that are artificial are cool, right? And we should take into account that value. And I think maybe you could make that argument, but then I'd wonder, why don't you go off and geoengineer another planet? And finally, someone could say, well, look, we've been engineering things for a long time, natural processes, in ways that nobody finds problematic. I've engineered the processes of the light in my eyes, right? Everybody here has probably had a vaccination which changes the way our immune system functions, and nobody objects to these things. And I agree, we oughtn't object to those things. And why not? Well, they're important for human flourishing and survival. So things of clear significant value are at stake. And so it's okay to engineer in some cases. So I'm not against all kinds of engineering. I just think we have to have that argument that geoengineering is really necessary. Because there's been studies by people like the McKinsey Corporation that suggest we can meet that 2-degree target by doing things like installing new, more energy efficient light bulbs. You might think that's ridiculous, right? That sounds crazy. How are we going to do it with light bulbs? Not just light bulbs, of course. But actually, there's a lot of energy in this building that's wasted, and we could be doing a lot of good to protect our climate with just more efficient appliances and more efficient energy use. The other thing we could do is use green energy. So they've done a study. They say we can meet this goal using existing technology without geoengineering, right, in ways that are possible. So I guess I want to hear that argument that that's not possible or desirable, or that we'll lose something else of significant value if we do it, before I say we go ahead. And so again, I've argued for this conclusion that we shouldn't do certain kinds of geoengineering unless somebody can provide us with good reason. And the argument for it was not about human interests, though you could give a similar argument, I think, about humans, but that natural things and processes sometimes have significant value. And we shouldn't risk damaging things of significant value unless we have good reason. And some kinds of geoengineering are going to risk that because they're going to change the way the ecosystems function. And so we shouldn't do those kinds of geoengineering. And so that's it. Thanks.
Free to direct questions towards individual panel members or the whole panel. We have about 17 minutes. Yeah.
I think similar arguments for risk management in genetically engineered crops. We talked about precautionary principles or substantial equivalence. I'm wondering how some sort of mechanism can be developed for geoengineering, or whether that's even discussed.
Why are you giving I would, yes, I'd say absolutely it's being discussed. And let me just, repeat the question was whether or not people are trying to develop frameworks for risk analysis or risk management of geoengineering in the same way that it's been done in the past for geoengineering crops. And I'd say, yeah, absolutely. It's a front and center effort. There's a lot of very good discussion that's going on about this in a lot more detail than has been provided tonight. Let me just say, just very quickly, my take-homes from the conference, the workshop so far. We've been through 2 full days of it. We've got a little bit of tomorrow. From listening to our colleagues in the sciences here who are actually doing the work, I think that, number one, at least the ones represented here, aren't claiming that it's a choice between geoengineering and mitigation or adaptation. That it's got to be a complex of all three. If we're going to do geoengineering, it's not geoengineering alone. And number two, I certainly would agree that I gave you a very optimistic scenario on where we might be with cumulative commitments, not actual actions that have been done yet, but commitments of what countries claim they're going to do by 2020. And that still leaves a sizable gap in order to where we need to get to climate safety. Now, if we can forestall the time to make up that gap through solar radiation management that's done on a scale that doesn't produce a tipping point and totally change the nature of the planet, which I think is also feasible, then I think it's definitely something we should start doing research on now, doing experiments on now, and possibly deploying. So the other thing that I've learned from my colleagues in the sciences here is that really the scale of experiments they're talking about now are not things that are going to destroy a species of fish or cool the planet to the point that it causes harms like that. I think it's something that can be responsibly done. I would also sort of say that just about every argument that I've heard about why geoengineering might not be in the interests of the sort of the equity issues at heart here, I think all of those can be turned around. If it looks like what we need is a certain amount of geoengineering to give us time to hit our mitigation and adaptation goals, I think that a very strong argument can be made that we ought to do that in the name of some kind of climatic justice. Because whether we like it or not, we're not moving fast enough yet on our mitigation goals, even though I do think that we're making some kind of progress. And that's the kind of risk analysis that also is needed in making the decisions we need to make.
My second on this. Or two.
Go ahead.
Okay, so since that touched just a little bit on the argument I gave, I guess I just want to suggest that as far as practical matters, I'm a little bit worried about conditionalizing on injustice or conditioning on immorality as to what was really morally required. So it may be that we can't actually get agreement, but that doesn't mean we're not failing morally. So then if you assume that we can't get agreements to do more efficient energy here and things that don't just protect, I don't know, our national security, then in a second best world like that, where we are failing morally, if the argument's right and there's no other good argument for geoengineering, then I would say, okay, what can we do to do this safely? And one of the things we might want to have is institutional review boards for universities that want to have research to ensure that the scientists are right, that we aren't imposing risks on people that they haven't really consented to. So here's just an example. If people want to do research on you, you have to consent to it if they want to spray something on you. If they want to spray it right over your head, there's no institutional review that they have to go through for human subject safety. And they don't have to secure your consent. Now, it might be that there's no risk, and so there would be no issue. But I think we do need to have some kind of institutional review, even for research. So that's an addition.
There was a question over here.
Just quickly, Andrew, in response to your point about potentially the need to do this for the sake of justice, to give us time to do mitigation and adaptation, does that at some level imply that that's not really up to us? It may be up to other people elsewhere in the world to ask us if we're the ones with the technology to do the geoengineering to protect them, but it's not really up to us to decide we need to protect them.
Yeah, no, I think that ideally, and I'm a big champion, as you know, of getting ahead of the curve on the governance issues. That because of the scale of interventions we're talking about, we need the most inclusive process for making decisions. And in fact, I'm actually pretty confident that if there was a fair and open process for making decisions, I think that in fact we would decide to do interventions like this, and this would be an agreement between the parties that have the technology and the parties who might benefit from the technology. And I think that the reason that I believe that is that when we look at a lot of the other agreements that we have been able to make on forestry, which have been very successful, probably the most successful set of agreements we've had so far, especially between particular parties in the world, and on adaptation, that's what you kind of see again and again and again, is a kind of a convergence on mutual interest where mutual capacity exists. But I do think that you need to set up an institution which makes it possible to properly vet all the issues and then come to a conclusion. But I think we need to move forward on this as quickly as possible because we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, at the back there.
So my question is, if we can't get people to come together and agree to actually reduce emissions now, then how do we expect people to agree to properly use all of these new technologies that they might use not necessarily instead but on top of geoengineering? How are we supposed to make sure that everyone does what they're supposed to do with that also?
Actually, that's a very good question. It was the question I was raising myself. The question was, if we can't get people to agree to a reasonable strategy for mitigation, how are we going to expect people to agree to a reasonable use of other technologies like solar radiation management? And I think that I would definitely agree with Andrew's view that what we need to do is start very early, getting a process in place, getting people in from a global perspective to start talking about this as a possibility. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy, and it doesn't mean it'll happen quickly. But I think we have to put, this is one of those arenas where we really need to put a lot of our energy into the governance process early up, as well as with your suggestion of making sure that we also have, in a sense, researchers really looking at the ethical and social implications of the science and the technology. So it's got to be a very integrated, very interdisciplinary collaboration between scientists, engineers, folks who work on ethics, and folks who work on governance.
There was this discussion of, I mean, I accept that some populations are more vulnerable to climate change than others. That seems obvious. It would seem likely that those populations most vulnerable to climate change would most benefit from the, say, geoengineering. However, that in the discussion, that appeared not to be the case. There could be sort of second-order effects of rainfall distribution or something that would make that not true. What I couldn't tell from the discussions was whether this conflict of interest on whether geoengineering was beneficial or not was a real conflict of interest between different regions or just a hypothetical conflict of interest between different regions. Can any of the speakers point to country A, a named country A, would be harmed by geoengineering where a country B would benefit, or something along those lines?
Okay, so the question is, I think there were two parts to that question. Question number one, wouldn't those countries or regions or populations that are currently most vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change potentially benefit most from geoengineering? And the second one, could there be possibly a conflict of interest? Country A engaging.
I would like specific examples of conflict of country A saying turn the knob down, country B saying
Right.
turn the knob up. I'm not sure if that's hypothetical or a real conflict.
Okay. So the first part of that question, I think yes, there is a possibility that countries that are in the subtropics and the tropics could potentially benefit. I think what I have seen so far from the research, and I think we heard that from Alan yesterday, that there is a strong likelihood that the monsoon patterns, and that has specific reference to sulfate aerosol dispersal, may be impacted most, right? So that droughts, and you can add to that, that droughts and decline of rainfall are a possibility because of impacts on the monsoon pattern. I think what we probably would want to see from the scientists is a better understanding of under which strategies, under which conditions, under what time scale, under what spatial dimension. What we want to see is which are the consequences that occur. How is a local climate pattern be impacted? What does that mean to food production? What does that mean to crops? What does that mean to water availability? And I think we want to see these, and I think then we can discuss if there are real benefits that look likely. Conflict of interest, one country engaging. I think what is so difficult here for me to judge is, well, let's think about aerosols in the atmosphere. They will not stay where they are, right? We have global circulation patterns, so they move, certainly, or can move to areas that are hundreds of miles away. And they certainly can have impacts over there. So except for China, I think, that has engaged in cloud seeding during the Olympics, as far as I'm aware of, I don't know if there was a country that protested. So I think right now we're talking about hypothetical scenarios about testing and deployment. So we don't have a real case yet where it actually negatively impacted. What I want to say in the context of benefiting, right, we could make the same argument that countries in Africa should be the ones that benefit most from green revolution crops, should benefit most from hybrid crops, from crops that are genetically modified because they may enhance food security. Well, it had turned out for Africa that many of the countries actually boycott genetically modified food crops because many of these food crops actually include what we call, what's the term? Terminator seeds. That you cannot keep the seeds because they will not serve as seed stock for the next year. So they actually render developing countries dependable on industries that deliver these seed stocks every single year. And there are several countries in Africa that refuse to take actually food aid based on genetically modified seeds.
I think it might be worthwhile our climate scientists, I don't know if Alan or Phil wants to just say something about precipitation pattern models very briefly. Since the question was about uneven distribution of precipitation.
Yeah, one of our climate model simulations did show a reduction of the monsoon precipitation for one particular scenario, putting aerosols in the stratosphere. But other simulations have not shown the same pattern. Models are not very good at getting the details of precipitation patterns around the world, and so we've organized an international intercomparison where all the new climate models in the world will be doing the same experiment. We call it GeoMIP, Model Intercomparison Project, and over the next year we'll be looking at the simulations they do and have a much better idea of how robust this result is and whether, and for different scenarios. And then even if precipitation goes down, will that really affect food production? If there's more diffuse light, maybe the plants will grow better. If it's cooler, maybe there'll be less evaporation, so the soil moisture is what the plants care about, not precipitation. Might not change very much. So we're looking into all of that, and then if you actually look at the data of food production in China, I have a student doing that. There's been a huge upward trend over the last several decades. There's little wiggles because of weather variability, but most of the trend is technology. It's better seeds, it's fertilizer, it's irrigation. So how important even is the climate in food production? Well, we're looking into that too. So this is a really preliminary result about the impact of geoengineering. It may not be that large, but that's one thing we're studying.
You might also argue that a high latitude country like Russia, which as growing seasons get longer, has a higher potential to benefit from a warming climate than about any other country. Maybe you could add Canada too.
I think that the Russians, though, after this summer, might
Yeah.
My name is Hannah Milton-Whitney, and I work with the Indigenous Environmental Network. We have actually sent delegations to the climate negotiations. We are in the process of working with people globally, particularly Indigenous communities. And I guess, the frustration with a lot of the science, particularly with what we're fighting for, we're fighting to protect our way of life, right? And the way that we've always lived, even in North America. And to explain it really succinctly, which is probably pretty blunt, is that I'm from Canada. The country's only existed for, 150 years? We're running out of clean air. We're running out of clean water. Our land is decimated. We're developing the tar sands, the biggest human industrial project on Earth, to benefit the U.S. for energy. And for me, it's an issue of not only consumption, but looking at the last 150 years. We didn't do this to our land. We didn't ask for it, and we don't see science as the solution because science and technology that have come and trade, economic systems have destroyed and decimated our way of life. We agreed to share this land with all the people that came here, and we're okay with that. But it's just frustrating to me that these projects that we don't really truly understand, we don't exactly know what the impacts are. We can do tests on them, but we don't know the long-term impacts on them. And on our land and on our way of being for all people, right? And I guess my frustration, our people have been spoon-fed the need to develop oil and gas, the need to develop nuclear, the need to develop coal, potash, you name it, whatever resource it is, at the price of our way of life, right? But we've been fed this spoonful of lies that the technology is there, the technology is clean. It's not clean. You know, you go to Fort Chip, the people are dying of cancer. There's no solution to that. There's no solution to taking away muskeg that has been there, that's taken 1,000 years to develop. You know, 178 people in a community of 1,200 have died from cancer-related, industry-related deaths, right? It's pretty serious. You know, and my argument would be that, you know, working with Indigenous people, we're saying the same thing as the scientists, that the global consumption rate has to stop. But we don't feel that solutions like this are necessarily what we need to do. We need to reframe the way we think about climate change, the way we consume, right? Because we have this global industrial mechanism for trade, right? For transportation of our food, for oil and gas and so on. We're creating all these international mechanisms, trade agreements, NAFTA, all these other things, to feed into this mechanism that's ultimately destroying the planet, right? And what other choice do we have, right? Because for me, you know, you talked about, well, whether it's the right solution about nature, but we don't know that, you know, and for me, I've had these people come from the nuclear industry to communities telling us that low-level radiation is okay. That's what science has told us, that have come to our communities, but we know better. And I guess like there's a definite distrust of the science when our ecological knowledge has been around for a lot longer and the science has proved it right? Time and again, it has proved it right. And I guess, you know, for me, it's an issue of morality, but it's also an issue of like, what right do we have to play God, you know? What right do we have to do all this stuff and destroy the planet? We have nowhere else to go, right? Really. The people in Africa have nowhere else to go. You know, we work with Vanuatu. They have 1 foot left before the whole island is destroyed, right? They have nowhere else to go. That's their homeland. They didn't do that to the planet. It wasn't our people that did that. We didn't create oil and gas issues. We live very close to the earth. And that's all we want, is to just live the way we always have, right? And I think all people deserve clean air and clean water, and I don't see how, you know, these technological solutions are going to create what we need for humanity. The reality is we have gone past the tipping point. We recognize the fact that in the Cancun negotiations that are coming up, that there isn't going to be a global treaty that's going to be met. There's going to be an agreement around carbon trading, and that's all they want to get out of this meeting in Cancun, right? We don't support carbon trading because it's greenwashing. It's greenwashing the tar sands, right? It's an economic financial system that's not doing it. Well, I want to know from them, you know, speaking to me as an Indigenous person and my colleagues, you know, like really, what kind of solution and what kind of guarantee can you give Native people that this is going to work, that it's going to be the solution, you know? And because I see the technology, I can see all your testing and all the things that you've done, but that's been done for coal, that's been done for oil and gas, that's been done for all these different kinds of development and resource extraction. And we've ended up with the crappy end of the stick, literally. You know, our people are dying.
There's no way we can respond to you quickly, but I'd be delighted to talk to you after the meeting if you're interested, as a scientist.
Does anyone on the panel want to just offer a quick reply and then we'll bring it to a close?
Go ahead. Just want to say thank you for voicing your concerns, and that I would love to hear what the scientists would say to you.
I guess I just want to say that because of the nature of this problem, it's very different than a lot of pollution problems. So it's not like you just turn off the taps and stop the source of the pollution and you clean up the site. The nature of the greenhouse gases that we're pumping in the atmosphere is they can persist for hundreds of years. And so let's say that our solution to consumption was the most ambitious solution to consumption. We just stopped consuming today, everybody on the planet. Totally turned off all the taps to all the carbon, to all the other greenhouse gases, got rid of all the cows farting, like just got rid of it all, right? Just stopped it dead in its tracks. We would still have a problem because of the accumulated gases that we've already put in there, and there's a lot of blame to go around and how they get up there and why we haven't done enough to stop them now. Even if we turned it all off today, which would be, you know, impossible, but even if we could, we would still need solutions to the warmer world that we've already set in motion. And if we don't come up with solutions, then we're going to have to, it's going to be the best combination of science, policy, ethics, other disciplines working together, and communities working together. then we're going to lose indigenous communities and other communities that are on the verge of collapse now because of the warming we've already set in place. And we're going to lose massive numbers of other species that we share the planet with. And so that's why we still have to be invested in these programs. None of them offer a guarantee. None of them offer an absolute guarantee to your community or anyone's community on solutions. And that's why one of my old friends, unfortunately died just a couple of years ago, Arne Næss, the founder of Deep Ecology. He had a saying, he said, the frontier is long, and there is an ample amount of work to be done. And so we've all got to work on as many solutions as possible to try to deal with the mess that we've already created and solve those problems going forward to minimize the harm that's already begun.
Let me just add a couple of words. I absolutely share your frustration. At the same time, I think as frustrating as and depressing Copenhagen was, I think we also have to recognize that there was an incredible number of indigenous communities, people represented, various climate lobbying groups, and I think climate justice is now very much on the table, and that was not the case 5 years ago. So I think it is important that that voice becomes louder and louder and louder, because I think it has to be. So keep on standing up. I think that's what we have to do.
Let's bring this part of the evening to a close. If you want to come and talk to our panelists, please do, and let's just thank them once more.